Welcome back to another deep dive, everyone. Today we're really going deep, exploring the experiences of those often pushed to the margins, those who find themselves on the outside looking in, particularly within the U.S. education system and society as a whole.
Yeah.
And while race is going to be our central focus, trying to truly understand the core challenges they face,
Hmm.
the historical and systemic roots of those issues, and the ongoing fight for equity and justice, a fight that's far from over.
Right.
Our main guide for this deep dive is going to be Bettina L. PDF, which offers, well, a really powerful blend of personal experiences woven with this sharp historical analysis. It really pushes us to think about radical change and what that might actually look like. And for you, our listeners, our learners, we really want this deep dive to give you a clearer, more engaging, and more human understanding of issues like systemic racism, uh, educational inequality, and the historical forces that are still shaping our world today. We're going to try to connect seemingly disparate events and ideas, hopefully spark some aha moments along the way.
Good. Yeah.
So let's jump right in. I think a powerful quote that kind of sets the tone for this whole exploration is, "We who are dark."
Ah, yes. Those words, so powerful. Those are W.E.B. Du Bois words. And for marginalized communities, it's not just a statement. It's this deeply felt recognition of their shared experiences. It goes beyond just surviving each day. It speaks to a much deeper yearning.
Yeah, it's more than surviving, isn't it? It's about thriving. It's about really flourishing in all aspects of life. And the author makes a crucial point here saying, mattering for these communities, it isn't about seeking approval or validation from the dominant culture.
Right.
It's about something much bigger, much more radical. It's about creating completely new systems.
Exactly. Systems that are specifically designed to ensure genuine freedom. Educational freedom, political freedom, economic freedom, freedom within their communities. It's about fostering a sense of belonging so strong that basic rights aren't even up for debate. Who gets to truly enjoy those rights? The author uses the idea of citizenship and really who gets to experience the full rights and privileges of citizenship. It's been and continues to be so unevenly applied.
And that brings us to, I think, a really vital concept for understanding the layers of these experiences, and that's intersectionality.
Absolutely. The discussion here draws on Monique W. Morris's work, her really groundbreaking work, particularly her book Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in School. And Morris meticulously shows how black girls in school, they're often unfairly labeled, right? Labeled as disruptive, defiant, based on really deep-seated biases. And then these labels lead to, well, disproportionate and often harsh disciplinary actions. We're talking suspensions, expulsions.
And this isn't happening in a vacuum. Morris brings up this concept of age compression. Can you explain that a little bit? What does that mean in this context?
Sure. So age compression basically refers to this really troubling phenomenon where Black girls are denied the normal natural progression of childhood. They're prematurely adultified, seen and treated not as children, but as Black women. So they're saddled with these really harmful stereotypes, like being hypersexualized, perceived as loud or aggressive or rude. And it really robs them of their innocence, the very protection they deserve as children.
Yeah, that's a really disturbing image. And the book really stresses looking at this through that intersectional lens that we were talking about.
Yeah. So when we look at the bigger picture, intersectionality helps us ask these crucial questions. How do these different aspects of identity, race, gender, and others, how do they all overlap and actually intensify these negative experiences? So, for example, what does age compression look like for a Black girl who's also part of the LGBTQ plus community, or for Muslim Black girls, and immigrant Black girls with disabilities, or those who have been involved in the juvenile justice system? How do those identities intersect and play out in their lives?
It really expands our understanding of the challenges that they face, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it's not just about race and gender. The author gives an example of a Latina girl who might also identify as queer, be undocumented, have a disability. You can only imagine the combined impact of those different layers of marginalization.
It's immense. And it really raises the question of the cumulative effects of these different oppressions, the discrimination, the harassment, the violence that these young people face both inside and outside of schools. And, it's important to note here that while our focus in this deep dive is on the specific experiences of girls, Black and brown boys also face similar systemic issues. They just often manifest in different ways.
And I thought one really unsettling example that the book brings up is how the idea of arming teachers just completely disregards all of this complexity.
Yeah, that's a huge problem. This idea that arming teachers is a solution to school safety completely ignores the potential dangers that it poses for students, especially marginalized students.
Hmm.
Managed for Black and brown students, particularly girls who are already viewed with suspicion and subjected to harsher discipline.
Yeah.
Bringing more guns into schools only creates a more threatening, more unsafe environment for them.
It's mind-boggling. And all of this really underscores that this fundamental desire to matter it's been a constant and really difficult struggle, hasn't it?
And the historical context that the book provides is really important here. It argues that this ongoing struggle for Black, brown, and indigenous people to truly matter is tied to this historical invention of a human hierarchy. It wasn't, it's not a natural development. It was a deliberate construct, a social and political construct created to benefit white individuals. And these ideas have had and continue to have these really damaging, profound consequences.
Yeah. The book brings in Ta-Nehisi Coates, who makes this point that the very narrative of America, it often contradicts the lived realities of marginalized identities. There's this constant tension between the ideal and the real.
Absolutely. The tension fuels this powerful tradition of resistance and resilience, this determination to push back against injustice. The book points to these phrases like, we shall overcome, si se puede, we gon' be all right, as more than just slogans, but as a testament to that enduring spirit.
And this resistance hasn't always been peaceful, right? The author acknowledges this history of uprisings and rebellions as part of that fight for justice.
Absolutely. And the book really emphasizes that these acts of rebellion, while sometimes born out of anger and frustration, have actually played a crucial role in shaping a collective identity, in building community for marginalized groups facing oppression. It's through these shared struggles that communities have been able to create institutions and fight for their rights.
Yeah. And beyond those overt acts of resistance, there's also the role of culture.
Yes, and the book does such a great job of illustrating how creating culture, whether it's through literature, art, music, even food, even just finding joy, becomes an act of defiance in itself, a testament to survival, a powerful way of asserting one's humanity
Yeah.
in the face of dehumanization.
It's a way of saying we're here, we matter.
It's
This
your
idea of welcoming struggle and the pursuit of freedom it's a really powerful one, and it's a theme that the book really, really explores.
And it makes that connection to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s idea of the beloved community. This isn't some utopian dream. It's a community that's actively working towards justice, racial justice, economic justice, housing justice, health justice, queer justice.
Yeah.
And the very act of striving to create that kind of community, of mattering to each other, it is in itself an act of pursuing freedom.
And the book talks about different approaches to achieving this freedom. It looks at Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolent resistance,
Right.
often working alongside Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker's incredible organizing skills. And then you have someone like Angela Davis pushing for systemic change through mass movements. But even though those methods are different, they're all ultimately striving towards that same goal of liberation.
Absolutely. And this connects to Michael Hames Garcia's idea that freedom isn't some end state, like we arrive at freedom and then we're done.
Yeah.
He argues that freedom is a practice. It's something that we have to constantly work towards. It requires this ongoing engagement in transforming society.
Yeah, because as long as even one person is unfree, then none of us are truly free.
Exactly.
That understanding is so foundational to abolitionist teaching, and this leads to the idea that the fight for educational justice it's a long-term, difficult endeavor.
No easy fixes. The book is very clear on that. It requires this sustained people power fueled by the same spirit, the same ideas that drove the abolitionists in the past. And the fact that marginalized communities are constantly tasked with dismantling these centuries-old systems, that is itself a form of systemic racism.
Yeah, yeah. Toni Morrison had a quote about racism being a distraction, and I think it really resonates here. She said, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And that need to constantly fight for basic dignity, it prevents people from being able to fully invest in building and thriving.
Powerful words.
Mm.
And the book reminds us that the goal is to move beyond just surviving,
Yes.
towards thriving.
And that contrast between what the book calls the educational survival complex and abolitionist teaching is really at the heart of its argument. So can you break down what the author means by this educational survival complex?
So the educational survival complex, it's essentially an industry that's built on this underlying assumption that marginalized children and their families are just trying to make it, to just get by. So you think of programs like Teach for America, where people with very limited teaching experience are placed in these under-resourced schools with the goal of helping students survive for a few years. And the book's argument is that this entire framework, it thrives on this idea of these communities being perpetually underserved and failing, much like the prison system.
It almost draws a parallel between the narratives we use to talk about mass incarceration and those used to explain disparities in education. Like,
Right.
there's a certain segment of the population that needs to be, quote unquote, saved from themselves.
Exactly. And it creates this climate of fear and outrage. It's a very lucrative business, too.
Yeah.
We're talking about billions of dollars generated by things like standardized testing companies and the prison industry. They have a vested interest in maintaining that status quo.
Yeah.
If the problems were solved, their profits would disappear.
And the reforms that come out of this survival complex are often really superficial, aren't they? They don't really get to the root of the issue.
Right. The book critiques that focus on test-taking skills, on trendy acronyms, grit labs, character education, and sees those as really just survival tactics.
Yeah.
They don't actually address the deeper structural barriers. Things like systemic racism, ongoing discrimination, concentrated poverty, lack of access to higher education.
Yeah.
These minor adjustments, they're just not enough to create real change. What we need is a radical reimagining, a rebuilding of our schools based on principles of justice. Intersectional justice, anti-racism, love, healing, and joy. Those are the cornerstones of abolitionist teaching.
And this history of what the book calls white rage in education, that's really crucial to understanding how we got here.
Absolutely. The book argues that the very foundation of public education in America is intertwined with white rage,
Yeah.
with anti-blackness, with sexism. The first public schools, they were exclusively for wealthy white males.
Yeah.
And throughout history, whenever marginalized groups have tried to educate their children in ways that honor their cultures and languages, they were met with fierce resistance.
We see this horrific pattern in the forced assimilation of Native American children, in boarding schools.
Exactly. The forced removal of Native children from their families, it was a deliberate act of cultural genocide aimed at erasing their identities.
Right.
And then you have the insidious separate but equal doctrine,
Right.
which is really just a way to maintain white supremacy in the face of demands for equality.
And even the hard-won desegregation of schools, that wasn't necessarily seen as a clear victory by everyone within the Black community.
And the book highlights this, talks about Derek Bell and even W.E.B. Du Bois himself, who argued that maybe the focus should have been on ensuring equal resources and quality education within Black schools,
Right.
rather than just integrating into a system that was still fundamentally unequal.
Right.
Du Bois said, Negro children needed neither segregated schools nor mixed schools. What they need is education. It really makes you think about the true goals of desegregation and whether those goals were actually met.
Yeah, and whether that idea was successful, it really makes you think critically about the outcomes of all of these, quote unquote, educational reforms.
Because despite decades of reform efforts and tons of money, Black students attending charter schools, even those in low-income communities, they don't graduate from college at significantly higher rates than their peers in traditional public schools. The book cites data on the fading American dream and how fundamental things like life expectancy are tied to factors like education, income, where you live.
And the financial motivations behind this rapid growth of charter schools, that's pretty telling, isn't it?
It really is. The book connects corporate school reform to what's been called disaster capitalism. Investors, they use things like the Community Renewal Tax Relief Act to get huge tax benefits in these depressed areas, while at the same time lobbying for deregulation that allows these charter schools to just proliferate.
Yeah.
It basically opens up public education to the highest bidder. You have hedge fund operators, tech CEOs making huge profits with little regard for the educational outcomes of the students themselves.
It sounds like a system that's almost designed to profit from existing inequality.
It is. The book argues that corporate school reformers, they prey on the hopes of marginalized communities,
Hmm.
much like the predatory lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis.
Hmm.
And when the inevitable charter school bubble bursts, it's going to be those same communities left with what Gloria Ladson-Billings calls education debt, this debt that has been accumulated over time due to these deep injustices.
And the impact of this educational survival complex goes beyond just academics. The book talks about this concept of spirit murder, which is it's a really heavy, heavy concept.
It is. The book argues that the constant pressure of existing in survival mode, the daily encounters with racism, with low expectations, it inflicts a kind of spiritual violence on Black children. It's
Yeah.
like a slow death of the spirit. It undermines their sense of self-worth and potential.
Yeah. And the examples the book gives are really heartbreaking. Things like the arrest of Ryan Turk for taking a milk carton even though he was entitled to free lunch. And the threats against students like Vanessa Van Dyke and Tiana Parker for wearing their natural hair. And then the blatant racism from teachers like Diana Velicic and Guy Hamby. These incidents are often dismissed as just bad apples. But the book makes a strong case that these aren't isolated incidents at all.
Right. They're symptomatic of a much larger problem, this
Hmm.
deep-seated systemic issue that's rooted in white supremacy.
Yeah.
And the book talks about the work of Patricia Williams, who explains that racism inflicts these deep personal, psychological, and spiritual injuries. It robs Black children of their humanity, their dignity.
Yeah.
And this spirit murder is compounded by the intersectionality of other forms of oppression based on gender, citizenship, religion. The list goes on.
And ultimately, as the book points out, we can't expect education alone to solve these problems.
Right. The book, it quotes Jean Enion, who said, "As a nation, we have been counting on education to solve the problems of unemployment, joblessness, and poverty for many years. But education did not cause these problems, and education cannot solve them. So we have to look at the root causes, systemic racism, the systems that are designed to keep marginalized communities from truly mattering."
And that leads us to the chapter titled Mattering, which really delves into the power of personal stories and the importance of community.
And that chapter starts with these really powerful quotes from both Toni Morrison and Eduardo Galeano, who both stress the importance of remembering and truly seeing the worth of marginalized communities, the communities that are often ignored or misrepresented.
Hmm. And the author shares some really personal experiences from their own childhood growing up in Rochester, New York.
Yeah, they talk about how what they were learning in school felt so disconnected from the realities of their community. A community that was struggling with deindustrialization and the war on drugs. There was this pervasive feeling of irrelevance, this sense that the colorblind rhetoric that they were hearing, it wasn't helping.
Which really highlights the limitations and the harm of just ignoring race, doesn't it?
It does. What they needed, what they were craving, was more than just love and compassion. They needed to see themselves, their community, reflected in a positive light, to counter those negative stereotypes that were so prevalent.
And there was this turning point with a Black teacher named Mrs. Johnson.
Yeah, Mrs. Johnson. She wasn't just a teacher. She believed in her students, especially her Black students. She fostered a sense of community in her classroom, and she had these high expectations for them. It's such a powerful example of the impact that a teacher who really sees and values their students can have.
And then there were these community initiatives like FIST, the Feminist Institute for Social Transformation.
And FIST was so important because it focused on Black consciousness, on raising political awareness among young people. They challenged those negative stereotypes and taught them that being Black was a source of strength, of pride,
Mm.
and it gave them that sense of self-determination.
And the book talks about how important Black teachers are for Black students.
Yeah, the research is very clear on that. Having even just one Black teacher in elementary school can significantly reduce dropout rates for Black students and increase their aspirations to go to college. But it's not just about representation. It's about having educators who really embrace an anti-racist and abolitionist approach to teaching, challenging those systemic inequalities.
And that really connects to what Bernice Johnson Reagan calls the sweetness of the struggle.
Right, exactly. It's about understanding that real learning, real growth often comes through those shared experiences of fighting for justice together. Anti-racist teaching it's not passive. It's about actively working to dismantle racism at its roots.
Yeah, and the author goes into Rochester's history, this really rich history of activism and community building.
Rochester was a hub for the abolitionist movement and the early women's rights movement.
Wow.
Frederick Douglass lived there, Susan B. Anthony, Harriet Tubman. The Underground Railroad had numerous stops in Rochester.
Wow.
And so, it's this really powerful history of resistance and community.
And the community itself clearly played a huge role in the author's life and giving them that sense of belonging and support.
Yeah, the 19th Ward where they grew up, it was a tight-knit community. People really looked out for each other as a safety net. But it was also a time of great economic change. Kodak, Xerox, Bausch and Lomb, these big companies that were once major employers, they were declining.
And that decline coincided with the rise of mass incarceration, fueled by the war on drugs.
And the book really connects those dots
Hmm.
between these economic shifts and the really damaging impact of the criminal justice system on Black communities. And talks about the tragic case of Khalif Browder, who spent 3 years on Rikers Island for allegedly stealing a backpack,
Yeah.
and then ultimately took his own life after being released. It's just a heartbreaking example of this systemic injustice.
And the book paints this really stark picture of the socioeconomic conditions in Rochester, high poverty rates, low graduation rates. It's a city that's really struggling.
It is. It really underscores those systemic factors that are driving these disparities.
Yeah. But even amidst all of that, Ella Baker's philosophy offers this path forward.
Yeah, Baker's emphasis on grassroots organizing, participatory democracy, and her critique of all forms of oppression. It provides a really powerful framework for moving beyond surviving and towards thriving. Her belief that strong people don't need strong leaders. Her
Mhm.
focus on empowering everyday people, that's central to the book's vision of educational freedom and community upliftment.
And now we come to the section Grit, Zest, and Racism with the subtitle The Hunger Games Metaphor, it's pretty provocative.
Yeah. So this section, it really takes a look at all of these character education buzzwords, grit, zest, self-control, optimism that we hear so much about in schools, particularly in schools serving low-income students and marginalized students.
Hmm.
And the book acknowledges that there's a historical precedent for this emphasis on morality and education, but, it really gained steam in the 80s and 90s as a supposed solution to social problems.
And the author makes the argument that this focus on individual character traits can actually be a distraction. It shifts the focus away from the systemic issues that are at play.
Right. They talk about the civic empowerment gap, this idea that instead of teaching students how to participate in democracy,
Yeah.
how to question injustice, the focus has shifted to just promoting obedience and compliance.
Yeah.
It's basically telling marginalized children that if they just work hard enough and behave themselves, everything will be okay. And history shows us that that's just not true.
Yeah. Yeah. And the book's critique of the character lab and Angela Duckworth's grit theory it's really interesting.
They use Trayvon Martin's case to show how inadequate these character traits are
Yeah.
in protecting marginalized youth from violence.
Right.
The character lab's definition of social and emotional intelligence,
Yeah.
it doesn't take into account the realities of racial profiling and the systemic violence that these young people face.
Yeah.
Trayvon Martin was aware of the racial dynamics at play. He tried to flee a dangerous situation. He fought for his life, but none of that so-called grit or self-advocacy could save him.
Yeah, it really underscores the absurdity of just focusing on individual character when the problem is so much bigger than that.
Exactly. The book argues that this emphasis on grit and zest, it individualizes the response to systemic problems. It ignores the impact of toxic stress, of living in poverty, of experiencing trauma.
Yeah.
And research shows that kind of stress can literally change the way your brain develops and functions. It can make it harder to learn, harder to regulate your emotions, harder to thrive.
And the book specifically looks at the KPP charter schools and their emphasis on these character traits.
Yeah, they use these grit growth cards and then see that as part of the educational survival complex.
Yeah.
It's putting the burden on the individual student without addressing the systemic barriers. And the book contrasts this manufactured grit with the real grit of the working poor, who are out there every day facing incredible obstacles.
And the author talks about how their own survival and their ability to thrive was was due in large part to their community,
Hmm.
to having a strong network of support.
Right. They had mentors, they had family, they had neighbors who looked out for them,
Right.
and not all children have that.
Yeah. And this leads to this call to protect children's potential, to go beyond those Band-Aid solutions and provide real sustained support. Mentoring, tutoring, leveraging power and privilege to create opportunities.
And the book also talks about the vulnerability of girls and women in these communities. It references things like the Atlanta child murders and sex trafficking, which are horrific examples of the dangers they face.
Yeah. And Erin Godfrey's research is really important here. She talks about the need to prepare children to face injustice, to equip them with the tools to understand and challenge those systems.
Right. Because the myth of meritocracy is just that. It's a myth.
Yeah.
And the book uses the case of Trayvon Martin, again, the delayed arrest of George Zimmerman, the acquittal, and the role of stand your ground laws as examples of how the system is designed to protect itself
Yeah.
from challenges to the status quo.
And now we get to this final section, abolitionist teaching, freedom dreaming, and Black joy. And this feels like a shift towards solutions, towards finding hope in the midst of all of this.
It is. This chapter draws on historical examples of abolitionist resistance,
Mm.
like the story of Ellen and William Craft. And it talks about William Lloyd Garrison, and it looks at the contradictions within movements, like the racism that existed within the women's suffrage movement.
And it talks about places like Beacon Hill in Boston and the African Meeting House, which were really important centers for abolitionist activity.
Yeah, they were hubs for organizing and for sharing ideas. And the chapter also acknowledges Massachusetts' early efforts at integrating schools. It was a limited and often contested effort, but it was a start.
And this idea of imagination as a form of resistance, that's a really powerful theme that comes up here.
Yeah, the book quotes Nidizak Shange, who talks about the power of Black creativity in the face of oppression. And freedom dreaming, it's not just about escaping reality.
Right.
It's about envisioning a better future. And that vision can fuel the fight for change. It helps to preserve our humanity in these dehumanizing systems.
And we see that spirit in contemporary youth activism.
Absolutely. The DACA protests, King Johnson's letter about Christopher Columbus, Marley Dias's book drive, Corey Davis's fight against racist school traditions, and then the activism against gun violence, led by groups like Black Youth Project 100 and Dream Defenders. These young people are carrying the torch of resistance.
And it's important to note that the media doesn't always give equal attention to all activist groups.
Right. The book talks about how anti-Blackness can influence whose voices get amplified and whose get ignored. And it highlights the emergence of these teacher activist organizations that are working to dismantle the educational survival complex.
And then you have individual educators like Johanna Hayes and Mandy Manning who are using their platforms to advocate for marginalized students and to challenge injustice.
Right. And then you have these really interesting experiments happening, like in Jackson, Mississippi, where they're trying to build a more cooperative, more just society.
And the book really stresses the role that white people need to play in this work.
Yeah, the book talks about the importance of white people acknowledging and addressing their whiteness and their privilege. It quotes Whitney Dow and Molly Tansey, who talk about the inner work that white people need to do to understand their own racialized experiences and to challenge whiteness in their own communities.
And amidst all of this, all of this struggle, this fight, the importance of Black joy cannot be overstated.
Black joy is not about ignoring injustice. It's about celebrating resilience. It's about sustaining ourselves through the long fight. It's about honoring the legacy of those who came before us.
And the book doesn't shy away from the harsh realities that educators and students face. It talks about the need to feel everything, the pain, the anger, the outrage, and it critiques the limitations of teacher education programs, their failure to adequately prepare educators to address these issues.
Absolutely. And it brings in these really important concepts like settler colonialism, to help us understand the ongoing oppression of indigenous people. And then critical race theory with its different strands like Asian crit and femcrit. These are essential frameworks for understanding systemic oppression.
And it talks about the importance of recognizing community cultural wealth, the strengths and resources that exist within marginalized communities, and Black feminism, this crucial framework for understanding and challenging the intersection of race and gender oppression.
And it also touches on on the impact of neoliberalism on public services, like education and the resistance to it, like the Chicago Teachers Union strike.
And the devastating impact of racism on health outcomes.
The statistics on maternal and infant mortality rates for Black women they're alarming.
Yeah.
And it talks about this dangerous myth that Black people don't feel pain. It really underscores how dehumanizing those ideas are.
Yeah, and the author shares their own personal experience of being a mother, under the constant threat of white rage.
Yeah, they talk about the fear, the anxiety, the constant vigilance that's required to keep their children safe and their own journey towards healing. And it brings in Peter Temin's research on the challenges of escaping poverty.
Right.
How systemic those barriers really are.
Yeah. And it talks about the importance of elders, of intergenerational learning, of learning from the wisdom and the experience of those who came before us.
Like the Corey Kiwanis call for
Yeah.
that kind of intergenerational understanding.
And then there's this idea of white wellness as a necessary step for white people who want to engage in this work.
It's about doing that inner work, to really understand whiteness and white privilege, to dismantle those systems within themselves and their communities before trying to be allies to people of color. And the chapter ends by returning to Du Bois and quoting Nikki Giovanni, both of whom really underscore the enduring reality of racism.
Yeah.
And the book is dedicated to those who embody resilience, and it celebrates Black artistry through this list of powerful songs.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack, but I think there are some really key takeaways here for our listeners. We've explored the historical roots of inequality, the ongoing struggles for justice, the importance of intersectionality, the limitations of superficial reforms, and the power of community, resistance, and joy. Expert.